"You're my man now," said the Apache woman after the lonely cowboy saved her from the wolves. The wind screamed across the red pillars of Monument Valley, dragging dust and moonlight into ghostly swirls. Below the towering cliffs, a young Apache woman stumbled through the sand. One hand pressed against her bleeding shoulder. Her breath came ragged, shallow each step, carving despair into the desert. The wolves had followed her scent for miles. Their eyes gleamed like shards of green fire. Circling closer in the silver light, the air stank of blood and hunger. One lunged, teeth flashing white, and she swung a broken branch with the last of her strength. The impact only made them snarl louder. She backed against the cold stone wall, heart hammering, whispering a prayer in her mother's tongue that no one would ever hear. The nearest wolf crouched low, muscles tightening, and in that split second before the leap, she saw her death written in its eyes. Then thunder cracked. A gunshot split the night. The beast fell, and through the veil of dust and moonlight, she glimpsed the silhouette of a man on the ridge rifle, raised, long duster whipping in the wind, like a shadow sent by the desert itself. When dawn bled across Monument Valley, the world turned the color of rust and fire. Wind swept through the stone towers, carrying a thin whistle that sounded almost human, the cry of a land that remembered every loss it had ever seen. Silas Kane walked among that silence as if he belonged to it. The man was lean, sunburned, his face carved by wind and grief. A faded cavalry coat hung from his shoulders, though the army had forgotten his name long ago. He lived in a cabin built from driftwood and stone, hidden between two cliffs, where no road reached, a place meant for someone who wanted to be found by no one. 3 years had passed since the night he'd buried his wife and son, victims of a raid gone wrong, a raid he had guided. Since then, he had hunted only for food, never for men. The desert had become his confession ground, his punishment, and his prayer. When he carried the wounded Apache woman into his cabin that night, he didn't speak. Her blood had soaked through his shirt, her weight trembling against his chest. He laid her on his cot, stitched her shoulder under the flicker of a lantern, and cleaned the wound in silence. Now, in the pale light of morning, she stirred, dark hair tangled, face pale beneath a faint sheen of sweat. Her eyes opened slowly, black as wet obsidian, sharp even through pain. She looked at him, not with fear, but with defiance. "Where am I?" she asked. Voice hoarse but steady. Silas poured water into a tin cup, handed it to her. "Safe," he said simply. Her gaze lingered on the rifle, leaning by the wall, then on his hands rough, scarred, trembling just slightly. "You are soldier," she murmured. He looked away, jaw tight. Not anymore. A long silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters like restless ghosts. Teya, that was her name, turned her face toward the sound, eyes distant, as though the desert itself were calling her back. Silas knew that look. He'd seen it once in a mirror. Years ago, the look of someone who wanted to disappear into the horizon and never be remembered. The morning deepened into gold, and dust drifted through the cracks of the cabin walls. The fire had gone to embers, but the air still smelled of smoke and herbs. Silas sat by the table, running a whetstone along the edge of his knife. When he felt her eyes on him, Teya had pushed herself upright. The blanket slid down her shoulder, revealing the rough stitching of his work. She touched it, wincing, once, then fixed him with a stare as sharp as the knife in his hand. "Why?" she asked. He didn't look up. "You'd be dead if I hadn't." "That is not answer." Her voice carried a rhythm that made even English sound like a chant. "White men kill my people, burn our homes. You see me dying, and now you save me." He set the knife down. "I didn't see a tribe last night, just a woman surrounded by wolves." For a moment, the only sound was the wind against the walls. She watched him, studying every movement. as though searching for the lie. "You were soldier," she said finally. "I know the coat. Cavalry blue. You hunted us." He met her eyes, then gray, weary, and unflinching. "Yes." Once, Taya's breath caught. She tried to rise, but her leg gave way. Silas stood, steadying her by instinct, and for an instant, their faces were close enough for him to see the faint scar beneath her eye. A mark of something older than the wound on her shoulder. "Let go," she hissed. He stepped back, hands raised. "You shouldn't move. You'll tear the stitches. I would rather die standing than sleep in the house of my enemy." Her defiance burned in the dim light. Silas said nothing. He crossed the room, poured water into a bowl, and left it by her side. Then he went outside, boots crunching over the dry earth. The sun hit him full on, blinding and merciless. He took a long breath, letting the heat bite into his skin. Behind him, inside the cabin, he heard her cough, then the quiet sound of her drinking. All afternoon he worked by the corral, mending a fence that didn't need fixing. The silence between them stretched like the desert itself. Yet when dusk fell and the coyotes began their far-off wails, he found himself listening for another sound, the faint movement of her within the cabin, the proof that she was still alive. When he returned, she was awake, watching the fire. Her eyes no longer held hatred, only exhaustion and something harder to name. "I dreamed of my mother," she said softly. "She told me a stranger's kindness is never free." Silas sank into the chair opposite her. "Then you owe me nothing," he said. "You can leave when you can walk." Her gaze flicked to him, wary yet searching. "And if I cannot walk, then I'll keep you alive until you can." Outside, the wind rose again, whistling through the canyons like a warning neither of them fully understood. Days passed in a quiet rhythm that neither of them spoke of. The desert shifted its colors from rust to gold to gray, and the wind no longer howled, like a wounded thing, only whispered through the cracks of the old cabin. Taya could sit up now. She helped with small chores, clumsy at first, stubborn always. One morning she tried to carry a bucket of water from the well. Silas caught her when her leg buckled, steadying her before the bucket spilled. "You're still weak," he said. Her chin lifted. "Weak does not mean helpless." He almost smiled. "No, it doesn't." They began to speak more, though their words came slow, like water through dry earth. She told him of Red Mesa, her father Hoktan, and the land her people called sacred. When she spoke her language, the syllables rolled soft and mournful, like songs meant for the wind. Silas listened, though he didn't understand a word, only the ache behind them. In return, he showed her how to mend a boot, how to load a rifle, how to tell the hour by the color of the cliffs. "The desert tells time by its shadows," he said once. She nodded, touching the faint light edging the stone. "Then you and this land are the same," she murmured. At night, they sat by the fire. Sometimes they shared a little dried meat, sometimes silence. The distance between them narrowed, not by words, but by the comfort of not needing any. One evening, as rain began to whisper against the roof, she looked at him through the flicker of firelight. "Your eyes," she said, "they see far, but never close." He didn't answer. "You hide something," she added quietly, like man who walks with ghost beside him. Silas's hand tightened around his cup. "Maybe I do." Who was she? He didn't meet her gaze. "My wife. And my boy." The words hung there, heavy as the rain. Taya said nothing for a long while. Then she whispered, "You carry them with you. I carry mine too. The dead do not stay buried in Red Mesa. They travel in the wind." Silas looked into the fire. "Then maybe that's why I can still hear them." Later, as she drifted to sleep, he watched her breathing steady, the firelight tracing the faint scar along her cheek. There was strength in her fragility, a quiet defiance that reminded him of something he'd long forgotten: the will to live, no matter what had been taken. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, echoing through the red pillars like drums from another world. Silas lay awake, staring into the dark, and realized that for the first time in years, he was afraid not of dying, but of losing what had come alive again inside him. By the fourth morning, Taya's wound had begun to darken at the edges. Fever glazed her eyes, and her breath came shallow. Silas knew that look: infection. He'd seen it before, and it didn't forgive. She sat slumped near the doorway, muttering in her own tongue, until finally she caught his sleeve. "The plant," she rasped. "Red mesa, under the white stones near the river bend. If I don't take it, I will not see another sunrise." He hesitated. "That's 2 days from here. Your people would kill you if they found you there." She finished for him. "Yes, but if you wait, ID anyway." For a long moment he stared at the horizon, where the cliffs rose like frozen waves of fire. Then he nodded once. "Then we ride at first light." The journey began under a hard, merciless sun. The desert stretched wide and soundless, dust shimmering like glass around them. Taya rode behind him on the mare, her hands gripping his coat as the wind tore through her hair. She said little, saving her strength, but her body trembled against his back with every breath. When the heat broke at noon, they rested by a dry stream bed. Silas gave her water, then wrapped his canteen in cloth to keep the rest cool. He watched her drink, the tremor in her fingers, the line of her jaw. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I thought I could fight it." "You've been fighting too long," he murmured. That night they made camp in a hollow between sandstone ridges. The sky burned with stars so bright they seemed to pulse with sound. Silas built a small fire, then cleaned his rifle. Taya lay wrapped in a blanket, her eyes half-lidded, watching the sparks drift upward like spirits. "Why do you live alone?" she asked suddenly. "Because I deserve to, Ward." "Deserve what?" "The silence." She studied him, her face unreadable in the flicker. "Silence is not punishment. It is death that moves slow." He didn't answer. The words had landed somewhere deep, where no prayer or whiskey had ever reached. By dawn, the fever had worsened. They pressed on, climbing narrow passes where winds screamed through like angry gods. Taya leaned forward, whispering something he didn't understand. Maybe a plea, maybe a memory. When they finally reached the river bend, the land changed. Red cliffs, towering over pale stones, streaked with white veins. She pointed weakly. "There," she said. "The leaves grow where the shadow stays at noon." Silas dismounted, searched, and found the plant small, green-gray, sharp-edged, stubborn as life itself. He crushed it, mixed it with water, and helped her drink. They stayed there until sunset. The fever broke as the sky turned copper. She slept against his shoulder, her breathing deep, and even at last. But the peace didn't last. At dusk, a voice echoed from across the ridge: laughter, rough and slurred. 3 men on horseback appeared, rifles slung low, faces burned with sun and whiskey. "Well, look here," one of them drawled. Didn't know the soldier took to trading with Indians now. Silas rose slowly, hand hovering near his Colt. "Keep riding," he said. "There's nothing for you here." The man grinned. "Oh, I see, plenty horse, gear, and a squaw to warm the bed." The world went still. Then steel flashed, and the first shot cracked like thunder. When it ended, 2 men lay in the dust, and the third fled, screaming into the cliffs. Silas stood, breathing hard, smoke curling from his gun. The echo rolled away into the valley, until all that remained was the wind and Taya, pale but awake, staring at him through the dying light. "You would kill for me," she whispered. He holstered the Colt. "No, he said quietly. For peace. But you happened to be in the way of losing it. She smiled faintly. The first time he had ever seen her do it. Then I will try not to die again. That night, they sheltered in a cave while the wind howled outside. Taya slept beside the fire, and Silas watched the light flicker over her face, the shadow of the cliffs painting red across the stone. She dreamed aloud. Words half-formed. A man who looks back will find the wind has already forgiven him. Silas sat long after the fire burned down, wondering if forgiveness was something the desert could still hold. They reached the valley 3 days later. When the sky had turned the color of copper smoke, the air felt heavier there, as if the red stone itself remembered every oath ever broken upon it. Silas had begun rebuilding a corral beside the cabin when he saw the first rider crest the ridge. Dust rolled behind them, 6 men on horseback, their silhouettes jagged against the burning horizon. At the front rode a man in a long hide coat, his hair streaked with gray, a necklace of carved bone across his chest. Behind him, another rider's face gleamed young and angry. Taya froze. "My father," she whispered. Then, lower. "And Nakai." Silas's hand went to the rifle at his side, then dropped again. "Let me talk." The riders spread in a crescent, hooves stamping the dust flat. Hoktan dismounted first, slow and deliberate. His eyes swept the cabin. Then Silas. Then his daughter. "You live," he said in his own language. "The wind has not taken you yet." Taya stepped forward, head bowed. "Because he saved me." Nakai's laugh was sharp, cutting the dry air. "He saved you, or claimed you," his gaze slid to Silas. "Full of poison. A white man hides our chief's daughter in his den. Tell me, what does she owe him? For that kindness." Silas didn't move. "She owes me nothing." The younger man's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. "You speak like you own her." Before he could draw, Hoktan's voice cracked like a whip. "Enough." He pulled a cord from his neck, a pendant of black obsidian, polished smooth with age, and hurled it to the ground between them. "Whoever spills blood before I pick this up," he said in a low thunder, "will no longer call himself child of Red Mesa." The desert fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Taya's voice trembled, but not from fear. "I will not belong to any man," she said. "Not by promise, not by debt." Nakai's nostrils flared. "You dishonor me before your father." She met his glare. "You dishonor yourself when you think a woman is a prize to be kept." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Hoktan's shoulders eased, and something like sorrow passed through his face. "Your mother once spoke those same words," he said quietly, "and it cost her life." He turned to Silas. "You walk on sacred ground. Soldier, you think I should let you live because you pulled my daughter from the teeth of beasts?" Silas met his gaze. "I didn't save her for gratitude. I saved her because I couldn't bear to hear someone else die screaming in the dark." Hoktan's eyes searched him, the rough coat, the hollow look, the scars carved deep into both face and soul. Then, slowly, he nodded. "If you keep her with respect, not with chains of flesh, but with the weight of your word." Nakai made a choked sound, his fury breaking loose. "You would give her to him. I give her to no one." Hoktan said, "I only release her from what binds her." He bent, picked up the obsidian pendant, and held it toward his daughter. "Freedom is a path with sharp stones. Child, step carefully." He mounted again, the others following, and as they rode away, the wind rose, sweeping red dust over the valley until all trace of them was gone. Taya stood in the stillness, fingers closing around the pendant her father had left behind. "He has not forgiven," she said softly. "No," Silas answered, "but he's given us a chance to deserve it." The sun sank behind the cliffs, and shadows swallowed the valley whole. Neither of them saw the figure watching from the far ridge Nakai, his face carved by hatred, his hand tight on the hilt of his knife. That night, the wind turned strange. It came from the north instead of the canyon, carrying a dry scent of mesquite and smoke. Silas felt at first that uneasy stillness before the land itself changes, and went to check the horses. The moon had just cleared the cliffs, white and round as a coin. Inside, Taya was grinding herbs, humming a half-remembered song from her mother. When he stepped back in, she looked up. "Something moves out there," she said quietly. He nodded. "I know." The horses had been restless all evening, ears twitching toward the ridge. He loaded both rifles, checked the Colt at his belt, then doused the lantern. The cabin sank into darkness, broken only by the glow of the hearth. "Stay low," he murmured. Taya slid the Winchester into her hands without argument. The first arrow struck the door with a dry, hollow thud. The second shattered a jar on the shelf. Then came the war cry, a sound raw enough to tear the desert silence in two. Flames erupted outside. The corral had been set ablaze. The light flashed through the window, painting the walls blood red. "They came for you," Silas said, eyes narrowing. "No," she whispered. "They came for pride." Nakai's voice rose above the crackle of fire. "Come out, soldier. Let the wind judge whose blood is worth the desert." Silas's jaw tightened. He turned to Taya. "You know how to shoot," she gave a grim smile. "My father taught me long before he taught Nakai to speak." The next minutes blurred into smoke and gunfire. Two shadows moved outside, one near the corral, one circling the rear. Silas fired through the window. A cry split the night. Another figure darted for the door. Taya aimed low, squeezed the trigger. The shot rang true, but Nakai didn't retreat. He wanted her alive to prove his victory. He kicked through the side wall where the boards were weakest, bursting into the room like a storm of dust and fury. His knife flashed, slicing through the dim light. Silas met him head-on. The two men crashed into the table, splinters flying. Nakai's blade cut across Silas's shoulder. Blood darkened the old coat. Silas slammed an elbow into the warrior's jaw, sending him stumbling. But Nakai lunged again with the desperation of a wounded animal. Taya shouted his name, fired once not to kill, but to shatter the latch of the barn door. The horses bolted free, bursting through the flames. Their panicked screams drowned the chaos as they thundered past the cabin, scattering embers and men alike. Nakai staggered, momentarily blinded by smoke. Silas grabbed his arm. Twisting hard, the knife clattered away. The fight went to fists, brutal and close, until Nakai's fury spent itself in a wild swing that met nothing but air. Taya was the one who ended it. She struck him across the temple with the rifle's stock. Nakai hit the ground, dust rising around him. When he looked up, she stood over him, her hair wild, face lit by the fire, eyes dark with something deeper than anger. "You lose," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Not because I choose him, but because I never belonged to you." For a moment, Nakai only breathed, chest heaving. Then his gaze broke. Not in fear, but in shame. He turned his head aside, refusing to look at her. Hooves thundered again in the distance, the riders of Red Mesa, drawn by the fire. Hoktan rode at their head. The old chief dismounted before the cabin, his face carved in shadow and flame. He took in the wreckage, the burning corral, the men wounded, his daughter standing unbroken. "Enough," he said. The single word carried like thunder. Silas stood still, blood seeping through his sleeve. Nakai tried to rise, but Hoktan's glance pinned him where he was. "Honor is not taken by force," the chief said. "It is earned by restraint. Remember that, if you wish to live among men." Nakai bowed his head, breathing hard. "I wanted only justice. You wanted ownership." Hoktan corrected. "And that is the hunger that destroys us all." He turned to Silas then, his expression unreadable. "You understand the weight of this choice. White man Silas nodded once. I do. And still you take it, I don't take. Silas said quietly. I stay, if she'll have me. Taya stepped forward before the firelight. Sweat and ash streaked across her skin, eyes gleaming like obsidian, wet with rain. He will stay, she said, not as master, not as savior, as man who listens when the wind speaks. For a long moment, Hawkton watched them both. Then he reached to his neck and removed a small string of white bone beads old, smoothed by years of touch. These belong to her mother, he said, placing them into Taya's palm. She believed freedom has a price, but never shame. Now the wind carries that truth to you. He looked at Silas once more. The land may yet forgive, if you keep it with respect. Then, without another word, the chief mounted his horse and rode off into the dawn. His warriors followed, silent, until the sound of hooves faded into the canyons. When it was over, the fire had begun to die. Smoke curled into the sky, turning the first light gray. Silas sank against the wall. Exhausted, Tayak knelt beside him, pressing a strip of cloth against his wound. You should have let me face him, she murmured. He gave a faint smile. I think you did. They worked through the rest of the night, putting out what remained of the fire, burying the two men who hadn't survived their own pride. By sunrise, only blackened wood and scorched earth marked what had been their home. Silas stood looking at it, sweat and soot streaking his face. Guess I'll have to start over again, he said. Taya glanced toward the cliffs, where the wind moved in low whispers. Then we build where the smoke can no longer reach. And so they did. 6 months later, Monument Valley was in bloom. Wildflowers crept between the stones, stubborn bursts of yellow and blue against the rust-red earth. The new cabin stood where the old one had burned, sturdier, brighter. A garden patch fenced off beside it. The horses grazed nearby, their coats shining in the morning sun. Silas stood on the porch, sharpening a piece of wood into a handle for a plow. His shoulder still ached when the wind blew cold, but he had stopped counting the scars. Inside, Taya hummed softly, grinding cornmeal with steady hands. He turned as she stepped into the doorway. Her hair was loose today, a single white bead woven near the end, the one her father had given her. The morning light caught it, turning it to a spark of fire. You never told me what that means, he said, nodding to it. She smiled faintly. It means freedom bought with truth. My mother's words. Good trade, he said. She walked closer, her voice barely above the wind. Do you regret leaving the silence? Silas looked out at the red cliffs, the sun breaking through them like molten gold. Every day, he said, except when you're talking. Her laughter was soft, the kind that fades into the sound of the wind. She leaned against his shoulder, and together they watched a hawk wheel high above the valley. The land was quiet now, not the silence of guilt, but of peace. The air smelled of cedar and earth after rain. Taya whispered, the wind of Red Mesa carries voices of those we've lost. Maybe one day it will carry ours. Silas wrapped an arm around her. Then let it find us here, where we finally learn to live. The sun climbed higher, spreading light across the valley until the cliffs blazed like molten copper. The wind rose again, threading through the pillars, through the new cabin, through the open hands of two souls who had finally stopped running from the past. And somewhere in that wind, if one listened close enough, there was the faint echo of laughter, and the promise that even in the hardest country, life could still begin again. The wind softened, curling around them with the warmth of dusk. Silas sat on the porch step, sanding a piece of wood smooth, while Taya watered the small patch of corn and wild sage behind the cabin. The air smelled faintly of earth and smoke, and far off, thunder rolled across the canyons, the kind that never quite reached them. When she finished, Taya came to stand beside him. Her hands were damp, her eyes bright from the sun. For a long while, Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It simply was. She reached down, took the sandpaper from his hand, and set it aside. "You work too much," she said. He gave a quiet laugh. "Keeps me from thinking. And if you stop, then I'll have to face what's real." Taya looked at him, really looked, until the teasing left her face. "Then face it now," she said softly. "Because you are my man now." Silas froze. No one had called him that in years. The words landed like a heartbeat he'd forgotten he still had. He lifted his gaze, met hers. "If I am," he said slowly, "then it's because you taught me how to live again." She smiled small. "Sure," and full of the kind of peace the desert rarely gave. The wind swept through the valley once more, carrying their laughter into the red light of evening. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. At Untold Wild West Stories, every tale carries the heartbeat of the frontier, love born from loss, courage rising from silence, and the quiet redemption that still rides with the wind across the red canyons of the West. Every day, we bring you stories of men and women who dared to begin again under the same sun that once burned their sorrow away. So stay with us, and let the wind of Red Mesa remind you that even in the harshest lands, hope still finds a home.